Suzuki, the global popularizer of Zen, he was a lifelong friend of Nishida. They went to school together as boys. And even after Suzuki moved to the United States, they corresponded. And then when he returned to Japan, they would see each other occasionally. And Suzuki influenced Nishida's thinking a lot, especially with his reading of Buddhist texts, and in particular, especially Huayan, Avatamsaka Sutra, and the way he interpreted Huayan. So I want to start with a couple of quotations. So this is a quotation from Nishida. He was quoted by a student, Shimomura Torataro, who became a recognized philosopher in his own right. And Nishida said, "If you are going to read a Zen text, the record of Rinji, Rinzai-roku in Japanese, is all you need to read," unquote. In turn, Suzuki himself has been quoted as saying that, quote, "Since Huayan's notion of the Fourfold Dharmadatsu is behind Rinji's thought, unless you look into Huayan, you will be unable to comprehend the thinking of the record of Rinji." So Suzuki was deeply sympathetic to Huayan thought. Here's another quote from Suzuki: "The ideas that fill the Avatamsaka Sutra are the pinnacle of what had been developed and preserved in the East, in India, China, and Japan. It is indeed a marvelous historical fact that the thinking of emptiness from the Prajnaparamita Sutras had developed to this point," unquote. He especially esteemed the doctrine of the Fourfold Dharmadatsu, especially in its fourth level of the non-obstruction among thing events, Shishiwai. He argued that the logic of non-obstruction among thing events or phenomena implies seeing the other within oneself and to see oneself in the other, a world wherein we reciprocally respect one another's personhood on the basis of our mutual relationality. And it's interesting to note that after the war, Suzuki tried to develop a theory of democracy on the basis of Huayan. In his preface to, so connecting this to Nishida, in his preface to the first English translation of Nishida's Inquiry into the Good, Suzuki writes, "Towards the end of his life, Nishida seemed to have felt a new interest in Kegon," that's Huayan philosophy. "We often talked about it. Zen's relationship with Kegon is likely to have induced Nishida to take up the study of Kegon and to expound it in his characteristic way of thinking," unquote. So it's clear that Nishida at least noticed the proximity of his own thinking, dialectical thinking, to Huayan doctrines as expounded by Suzuki. Suzuki in his various works called the logic of the Diamond Sutra, that asserts the non-dual identity of form and emptiness, and which had influenced Huayan thought, the logic of is or is not. That's my translation of Sokuhi no Rondi. He identified this logic of is not with Nishida's logic of the self-identity of absolute contradictories, Zettai Mujinteki Jikodoitsu no Rondi. Nishida himself in turn stated in 1945, in a 1945 letter, quote, "I want to clarify that religion can only be conceived through what I call the logic of the self-identity of contradictories, that is, the logic of is not." So Nishida himself was identifying his own idea of self-identity of contradictories with what Suzuki called the logic of is not. Okay, so now Nishida. So I'm going to give you a summary of some of the basic ideas of Nishida before talking about the possible connections with Huayan. So through conversation, Suzuki inspired Nishida's development of a philosophy that took dialectics in a direction alternative to that of Hegel. Nishida was not only inspired by the Zen practice of his youth, that was when he was in his 20s, in his understanding of self-awareness, he kept to his later years a copy of the Avatamsaka Sutra he purchased during his college years, which must have been important to his development. And to these sources were added his conversations with Suzuki, especially on Huayan thought. So one theme that one notices throughout Nishida's Au-Verbe, even though Nishida goes through all sorts of transformations in his systematic philosophy, is the theme of self-awareness, jikaku. So in his early works from the 19-teens to the 20s, Nishida develops his understanding of self-awareness that implies a logical, self-reflexive structure of mirroring broader contexts, inclusive of both what becomes explicitly reflected upon and the pre-reflective context. Self-awareness as such for Nishida involves the realization of reality, where the genitive of is both subjective and objective. Hence, the prefix self, or ji, in self-awareness, jikaku, is not confined to an egological or personal sense. It is a process of auto-realization that objectifies and articulates the broader pre-objective context, even as it inevitably fails to exhaust the whole of that context, instead pointing to the irreducible process of self-differentiation of an undifferentiated, indeterminate unity, a groundless abyss that grounds and ungrounds our world, even as it determines itself in it, which he designates the nothing, or mu. In his 1926 essay, Place, or Basho, Nishida develops the concept of a place for propositions articulating the self-reflections and where knowledge is established. But that place requires a further place contextualizing it. And the more inclusive the context, the less determined the place, leading towards an unobjectifiable place. Undefinable as any determinate thing, it is a nothing, mu. He depicts each place mirroring itself within so that the more inclusive place not only envelops the more limited place, but reflects or mirrors itself in the latter. The unreifiable place of nothing mirrors itself by determining itself, its indeterminacy, into the determinate beings it situates. And these are some of the works I'm going to be referring to in the following that are important. And we're also going to move to the next slide, which shows that chart. It's easier to see that chart because it's enlarged here. In subsequent works, Nishida speaks of the system of universals and the determination of the nothing. Nishida summarizes the logic in his 1928 essay, The Intelligible World, in terms of a threefold system of universals, or ipansha, unfolding what he had described earlier as place, or basho. In the most superficial level, we make judgments about objects in the natural world. In the second, more concrete level, we are self-aware in the world of consciousness. And on the third and deeper level, we are immersed in the preconceptual world of meanings or values. To this, Nishida adds a fourth level, the level of religious consciousness, subsuming everything under the nothing, mu, as the world's ground or unground, self-negating itself to realize beings. Significant in the same period is the reference that he makes to the famous passage from the Heart Sutra equating form and emptiness, shikisokuzeku shiki. The ultimate universal underlying all differentiation and determining itself into this intelligible world is the unspecifiable nothing, mu. Tracing self-awareness back to its root source, plumbing its depths below the realms of nature, or objects, consciousness, or the subject, and intelligibility, or meanings, one realizes its auto-realization from where there is neither seer nor seen, where the subject-object opposition fades away. These levels loosely correspond to the different perspectives on the Dharmadatsu in Huayan. The universal of judgment that focuses on objects can be associated with the Dharmadatsu of thing events. The universal of self-awareness that focuses on consciousness and of intelligibility that focuses on the context or meaning might correspond to the Dharmadatsu of patterning or li. The relationship of consciousness and the meanings it projects upon the world may correspond to the non-obstruction between thing events and patterning, li shi wuai or riji muge. The nothing in Nishida corresponds to the emptiness, ungrounding that Dharmadatsu. But Nishida's thinking becomes even closer to Huayan in its subsequent thought in the 1930s and 40s when he focuses on the historical world, or Ekshiteki Sekai. The dialectical philosophy that Nishida develops from the 30s show remarkable similarities with Huayan's development of interdependent origination. This is when he shifts his attention to the outer world and its historical nature to develop his understanding of self-awareness from the world's perspective, whereby the historical world, whose structure Nishida describes in terms of the dialectical universal, or benshoteki pansha, and the self-identity of absolute contradictories, mujinteki jikodoitsu, is self-realizing and determining itself through us. Nishida rephrases the three levels of judgment, self-awareness, and intelligibility, now in terms of the natural world, the world of life, and the historical world, along with the fourth level, the nothing, grounding and ungrounding those realms. In our active involvement with the world, we are immersed in the histories that form us, while we in turn form them. Our acting in the world, shaping it, is also the world's own self-shaping, and as self-aware individuals, we are the world's self-mirroring focal points at which the world reflects itself, its self-expressive points, as well as points of self-awareness. In his 1943 essay on self-awareness, Nishida suggests that self-identity is a contradictory self-identity of many and one, reflected through differentiation into multiplicity. This structure is repeated without end within the world, imaging itself. When considering the manifold of individuals making up the world, Nishida stresses their individuality and autonomy while also reminding us that their identity is constituted through their radical interrelationality as non-substantial. Each is empty, shunya, or ku, of own beings, vabhava, and jisho. Likewise, the world in its interdependence with its elements are also empty. They are each an identity of the contradictories of being and non-being, affirmation and negation. He explicates this in Suzuki's terms of the logic of sokuhi, is not. The world structure here becomes very close to Huayan's conception of the fourfold Dharmadatsu. The radicalized dialectic of the world matrix is such that each mode of inter- and self-determination is mutually implicative, occurring in several coeval forms. 1, the universal self-determination. 2, the universal determination of the individual. 3, the individual's self-determination. 4, the individual's co-determination of each other. And 5, the individual's determination of the universal. The self-determination of the concrete universal reality is itself the self and co-determinations of its individuals. Nishida's ideas here approach Huayan ideas concerning the non-obstruction between patterning, or li, and thing events, shi, and among the thing events themselves, shishi. In turn, Nishida takes Huayan's idea of the Dharmadatsu that is a world of mutual non-obstruction among phenomena, whereby one is all and all are one, to understand them in terms of his own idea of the self-identity of the contradictories of many and one. The manifold determinations of the dialectical matrix are translatable into Huayan terms with almost the same meanings. Through such radical interrelationality, each individually what it is, shi, interdependent with others, shishi wuai, or jijimuge, and expressive of the whole structure, while the whole itself simultaneously is expressive of these individual determinations, Lishuai or Rijumuge. In the entire realm of interrelations, the Dharmadatsu, or place, in both systems, Nishida's and Huayan's, via non-obstruction or self-negation is empty of substance, vabhava. What Nishida formulates here in the 1930s in terms of the universalist determination of the individual and its reverse determination by the individual, and then in the 1940s in terms of the inverse correspondence between absolute and finite, whereby my awareness is an expression of the awareness of the absolute, again in both senses of the genitive, in Huayan terms would be Li Shi Wuai or Li Shi Muge. That is the mutual non-obstruction between thing events and their patterning. In Huayan doctrine, patterning, Li, is not a principle transcending material thing events, or Shi, from above, but rather is of the interrelations among those thing events. As the patterning of how phenomena interrelate and are differentiated from one another, it is immanent to the realm of myriad phenomena. Similarly, in Nishida's system, the universal is not some ideal principle transcending reality and ordering its material from above, especially Nishida's inverse correspondence, whereby the absolute, literally meaning that which is cut off from relativity by encompassing it, is seen as immanent to the world of relative beings via its own self-negation. And this is analogous to Huayan's de-transcendentalization of emptiness or patterning in its collapse into the non-obstruction among thing events. As a self-forming formlessness, Nishida's absolute, or mu, nothing, is itself shaped by the interactivities of its individual elements. In its non-substantiality, the place of nothing does not exercise domination over the manifold. Nishida himself refers to Huayan. So now, we were just looking at ideas that remind one of Huayan, and now I'm going to talk about Nishida's own references to Huayan. In the 1938 lecture, The Problem of Japanese Culture, he states how his conception that the one is many and the many are one is rooted in an Eastern way of thinking, especially Mahayana, and that his idea has something resonating with it. Then, in his 1940 book version of the same lecture, when speaking of the world's self-determination as the self-identity of absolute contradictories, Nishida refers to the Huayan formula of non-obstruction among thing events, Jijimuge, or Shishuai, and explicates it in terms of facts, Jijitsu, determining one another. He states that his own idea of the movement from the made to the making, tsukurareta mono kara tsukuru mono e, means the movement from thing event to thing event, koto kara koto e, through which the historical world determines itself, but as also meaning the non-obstruction, muge or uai, among thing events, koto or ji or shi. A couple of pages earlier, he cites the Hawaiian slogan of one is all are one. And towards the beginning of the text, he contrasts Fazang's conception of the non-obstruction among thing events with Hegel's dialectical method. In 1943, in an essay called On the Objectivity of Knowledge, when explaining his notion of contradictory self-identity, he refers to that Hawaiian understanding of non-obstruction between facts and truth. In his 1944 essay towards the philosophy of religion with the concept of pre-established harmony as guide, when speaking of the individual, Kobutsu expressing all other individuals, as well as the world, while the world forms itself through such expression, he connects the term expression, hyogen, to Hawaiian thought. To picture the complex dynamism of the dialectical world, Nishida in the 1940s also makes use of a metaphor that had been employed by a number of Western mystics and thinkers, the metaphor of the infinite or endless sphere with its center everywhere and its periphery nowhere. But in addition, he refers to the metaphor of interest net, which you're all familiar with. And the metaphor of interest net, the way Nishida uses it, certainly resonates with the metaphor of the infinite sphere, especially if we take the intermirroring jewels in that interest net as the countless centers of the infinite sphere. We can also reinterpret the endless sphere in terms of emptiness as the open sky, akasha, that one finds in the Prajnaparamita Sutras that supposedly inspired Nagarjuna's use of shunyata. So I'm going to now, do we still have time?
So we want to make sure we have enough time for discussion, so can you wrap it up in 2 or 3 minutes?
Okay, because I was going to talk about Nishitani. I have a couple of paragraphs on Nishitani. Nishida's student. Nishitani is probably more famous than Nishida, the most famous Kyoto school thinker. Nishitani also, in a beautiful way, he brings together this Western mystical metaphor of the infinite net, together with Indra's net, infinite sphere, together with Indra's net from the Huayan tradition. And he comes up with this idea of circumincessional interpenetration, circumincessional relationship of everything in the world. He expresses this as a field of emptiness. That's also very interesting to look at, but I'm just going to go to my concluding paragraph. So what is the takeaway to be obtained from the Kyoto School's appropriation of Huayan thought? There is a certain resonance in Nishida's and also Nishitani's development of the fourfold Dharma Datsu and Indra's net with contemporary conceptions in mathematics and physics of structures in nature that are one yet many, united yet manifold, perpetually unfolding macrocosmically and microcosmically. And I know that earlier you mentioned the popularity of quantum mechanics, but so I'm going to say that this kind of reminds us of the notion of the fractal, Mandelbrot's term. Its endless unfolding occurs through infinite self-differentiations and self-replications, difference and repetition, to borrow Deleuze's term. And with its center everywhere, it might also be likened to a rhizome, so we might call it a rhizomatic fractal, to push that Deleuzean language. This fractal nature is what the Avatamsaka depicts when speaking of, so this is a quotation, the miraculous manifestation of the inconceivable realm of the great tower containing the adornments of Vairocana, into which Sudana enters, where he sees a billion-world universe of hundreds of thousands of towers, each infinitely vast in space, but mutually distinct and reflected in each and every object of all of the other towers. That was more of a paraphrase. So would not its realization re-enchant even the most jaded of us in the face of increasing nihilism in the contemporary technological epoch? So that's it. Thank you. And also, I wanted to mention at the beginning, which I forgot, I'm continuing the theme of embeddedness, that was started at the front. It came up in the very first presentation by Albert Welter, right? Embeddedness of Hawaiian ideas in the